joyful play,
purposeful work,
rugged outdoor living,
our camps and conservation efforts,
teach timeless skills,
and kindle the spirit within.
Farm and wilderness.
Farm and wilderness.
Farm and wilderness. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Farm and Wilderness podcast. I'm your host, W, Director of Camps and Director of Camp Timberlake at Farm and Wilderness. If you've made it to this episode in particular, you're probably already pretty familiar with F&W and what we do. I say that because this is one of our most wonkish episodes to date. Wonkish, not wonky. Wonkish meaning we're deep diving into a very specialized part of the F&W experience. Now we talk about the program, the what that happens at camp, including all the activities and whatnot. And we've talked a little bit about the land all of it takes place on. The forest around camp really is as much a part of the experience as the games we play with our campers. This episode, though, goes into a part of camp that is seen all the time, but talked about a little bit less. The buildings and structures that we all inhabit during the summer. In fact, when we talk about what makes Farm and Wilderness unique, we'll tout the farm animals, the cabins without electricity, chores, and silent meeting. And after traveling and seeing lots of camps, I think our infrastructure, our buildings, are actually a big part of what makes us unique. And I mean this in two ways. One is the architecture itself. Each building is unique, and at many other camps I've seen, their buildings are a little cookie cutter with like a screened-in area, a large bunk room, maybe some curtains. And our buildings are anything but that, with each one having its own design and vibe. This one has a really great deck. This one has a really great swinging table. This one has incredible views of the lake. The second way I mean is how we actually construct our buildings. Almost every building on campus has been built with the help of campers. I have alumni who can come back and point to that board they put in one of our lodges with pride when they are a camper. Also, the buildings themselves are an expression of our values. There's a saying along the lines that if you want to know an organization's real values, look at their budget. In this case, you see it in our buildings. And as we talk to Jay today, he'll tell you that many of our buildings use wood from our land, that roofing was chosen for its environmental impact, and that they're built intentionally to hold community. Another way to see our values is in the scope of Jay's work. He's not head of maintenance, he's head of sustainable resources. His work connects our conservation efforts, our farm, our land management, the buildings, and yes, the maintenance of our structures. Our sheer size also shapes his work. He manages a total square footage in these six figures. That's 200 plus buildings, about 30 of those are Kaibos, 100,000 kilowatt hours produced by our solar panels each year. The numbers speak to the impact of his work at F&W, and he will be giving many more in the interview. Lastly, I am so geekly obsessed with how design of a place shapes the culture there. I remember being interested in this in college, going to Los Angeles, and like, why does LA look different from my small town Buda where I grew up versus New York? And how does that affect the people there? At TL, I see this in the way the road splits the camp in two, with all the cabins all nestled together below it, the program area is above it. So you kind of have this nice living area and kind of work play area. I see it in the way our campers enter our upper lodge from the side and don't go through a traditional cafeteria line. I see it in that winding path down to the silent meeting circle, which is just long enough for kids to settle down after songs, and we don't have to tell them to settle down. I've spent a decent part of my educational career trying to recreate F&W in different places. In an after-school program in South Central LA, in a classroom in Manhattan, in an extended day program in the Bronx, and in programs in Brooklyn and Sharon, Vermont. All that time I realized that yes, there are parts of the F&W program and experience that can be exported into other spaces. However, the fullness of it can only happen on our grounds with our buildings and spaces made specifically for the experience. I love talking to Jay. He is an institution here as well. He's been here so long and has been at the helm of so many of our recent initiatives, especially around carbon reduction and boosting our resiliency. He grew up in the Adirondacks and for years was a self-employed carpenter and a rock climbing instructor before Farm and Wilderness. He also found us a bit serendipitously, as Clarissa did and I did and a few others we've talked to so far, and decided that this was a place worth staying in. In addition to his F&W work, he serves as a board member for the Rutland Homeless Prevention Center and is on the select board, which is our Vermont word for town council, of Plymouth, Vermont, where Farm and Wilderness is. Before we jump in, there are a few words he uses that I want to define. First is not a word, it's a name. He mentions Chris Lord, who was the director of Timberlake before Tulio Browning, so before me 2 directors ago, and was my first boss at camp. He mentions Kaibos, which is just our word for a composting toilet. He mentions Wolves Cabin, a recent project at Timberlake that converted an old cabin into a much needed waterfront pavilion. And it was done and led by one of our campers. And he mentions Act 250, Vermont's land use and development law enacted in 1970. Brave Little State on Vermont Public Radio, VPR, recently did a great episode on Act 250 and its impacts on the state. Now, if you've been curious about our buildings or just want to geek out a bit about our carbon reduction, I am so excited to present this episode. And now, my conversation with Jay, Director of Sustainable Resources. So welcome, Jay, to the podcast. I'm really excited to finally get to chat with you. And who are you? What do you do here at Farm and Wilderness?
Good to be here with you, 2W and Atlas, of course. Yeah. So my title is Sustainable Resources Director. That encompasses many different things, but one of those is the facilities department. So I do monitor all our buildings and how we operate them. So I'm constantly monitoring all of the buildings at Farm and Wilderness. We have an inventory, and I'm thinking about how long those buildings are going to last. When are we going to replace them? Who is going to do the work? And what is the carbon footprint of that building to build and also to operate? And how is it going to best serve our community when we do reconstruct it?
So you have this title, Sustainable Resource, and you just told us a little bit about what that is. But will you say more? There's a lot of intentionality at Farm and Wilderness, and there's a lot of intentionality in that name. So what does it mean to be Director of Sustainable Resources, and not just resource and maintenance, like it is sustainable resources?
Sustainable Resources is charged with implementing capital projects, helping with the budgeting, coming up with the projects. And in doing that, there's this lens of sustainability over all of the projects, right? So they really have to fit in, no matter what we're doing in that project, it has to serve the organization well. It has to be sustainable from multiple angles for the organization. It has to be financially sustainable. It has to be sustainable for the users. And it has to not emit carbon. That is our priority. So it's kind of like that triple bottom line thinking, right? People, planet. I don't think we think about profit because we're nonprofit, but it is that lens that keeps us true to our values.
And it's not just you on Sustainable Resources. How big is your team? People are often surprised at how much of an organization or how much of Farm Wellness goes to this. It's you, and who else is on your team?
Yeah, so generally there's 4 to 5 of us, and in the facilities department there's 4 or 5 folks working usually year round on projects. It just depends on what we have going on during the year. And then we also have I work with the farm, and I also work with conservation, and we also apply that lens of kind of sustainability projects that we're working on. I mean, conservation in its own right is sustainability, right? It's thinking about how to manage that land well, manage it for climate resiliency, manage it for carbon sequestration and storage, wildlife habitat. Same thing with the farm. So when we're thinking about things that we're going to do at the farm, we're thinking about, I know Colleen's looking at what type of grazing are we doing so that we maximize our carbon storage in the ground, and making it sustainable. Water quality is the forefront of her mind with every decision that she makes. So that's kind of the team that works together at Farm and Wilderness to think about how we're doing the right things with infrastructure and how we can help program with their goals.
So I love all that. We're going to get to all that. And I was speaking to you before we started that there's a thing about your work that is both like visible to all our kids and campers and families because they live and exist in it, and it's kind of behind the scenes. And so I ask all the other directors this, but I'm curious for you, how did you get here to Farm and Wilderness?
So my story of getting to Farm and Wilderness is a long one. I found out about the rock climbing program here. I happened to be a rock climbing instructor at a college. They needed some help. And I said, yeah, maybe I can help you all out. And I'd recently graduated from college as an older adult. And I'd been studying the environment and racism separately, but two topics really relevant to Farm and Wilderness. And the time I made contact with Farm and Wilderness, I was contracting. So I was building custom homes over in the Adirondacks. Pretty enjoyable job. I'd learned a lot. And Farm and Wilderness was at a point with their infrastructure. And I was speaking with the executive director, Peter Bowen, at the time. He said, wow, we'd really love to have you help out here. And I said, I can give y'all a couple weeks. And I remember my first projects were building some tent platforms over at Timberlake. And matter of fact, Chris Lord's younger brother was assigned to work with me, all new people. And what I noticed was they had never seen some of the things that I was doing. They were really interested. And this is just my first experience with Farm and Wilderness, but they were picking up these skills, and all of a sudden they were just having the time of their lives building these platforms. And I thought, this is really fun. Mm-hmm. And so I left for the summer. They said, hey, can you come back and do some work? And during that time, I'd learned a lot about Farm and Wilderness's values, what they cared about. So every experience I had in my life up until that point suddenly led me to the right place.
Amazing. I love that story, and it feels so similar to so many others, which is kind of the universe provided, and we're all here together. So let's give the folks who are listening to this a sense of the scope of your work. And so I have just a few, kind of starting with numbers, actually, because folks think about, I go to a particular camp, I think about those lodges, but you were thinking about the entire thing. So I have a few questions for you of what are the numbers? So how many buildings do we have here at Farm and Wilderness?
236 plus or minus.
What is it like? What are the makeup of those buildings? Are they a lot of cabins, small ones? What is the...
They run from we included in that number is everything from a chicken coop or an outhouse all the way up to a full-size lodge or our dairy processing plant over at the farm, which we're not using at the moment. But I mean, it's a complex building with a lot of complex equipment in it. And then here we are at the maintenance facility that was constructed in 2010 for us to carry out that work. And it has all kinds of interesting features, including a lift for vehicles.
Yeah. Can you name all 200 some odd buildings?
I could show you where they were. The exact name might escape me, but I know where every single one is. I got to the point where I stopped seeing new buildings 6 or 7 years ago.
All right, I get that. All those buildings, what's the square footage we're talking about across all our buildings?
So across all the campuses, we are talking over 100,000 square feet of building footprint.
Wow. Okay. Solar panels. We have a set here. How many solar panels do we have? What kind of power output is that?
So we have a freestanding solar array here behind the maintenance facility. And we also have panels on the roof of Tamarack Farm. And together, in a good year, they provide the total of 100,000 kilowatt hours that the organization needs to operate our business. But, last summer, not so good. We had a lot of rain. Solar didn't produce as much. So we only, I would say, covered about 80 to 85% of our needs. But in a typical year, those solar panels provide everything we need. And the amazing thing they've done is they've allowed us to transfer from carbon-based fuel sources. So now we do a lot of electric heating, hot water heating. So those solar panels have been this way to spur us on to use more electricity.
Love that. I want to come back to our carbon work. Let's talk about KIBOs. People know a lot about that. How many KIBOs do you think we have? And what is the outputs we have each year in those?
So we have at least 30 KIBOs that I can think of. I didn't tally them up before you got here, W. But every year we produce about 15 cubic yards of human manure.
15 cubic yards. What is that size comparable to? We talking about a couple buses? What is the...
So if you saw one of the town dump trucks driving by, that holds about 10 yards. So 1.5 of those.
Awesome. Other numbers or metrics or things that you think to give us context for because we're talking about a lot of building, a lot of land, a lot of things, other things that might give folks who don't know much about your work some context to it's not just sweeping a couple buildings.
Yeah, so often one thing we really try to do here is we have sustainable building materials, and we harvest wood from our property to construct those buildings. And a lot of that is with the intent for campers to use that. So we pick certain species that are generally light, like pine or spruce, and we harvest about 10,000 what we call board feet off the property. So every year, and these are mature trees at the end of their carbon storage sort of cycle and sequestration cycle. And so, we view that as a lot more sustainable than having lumber trucked in from Quebec or somewhere else.
Really interesting. What proportion do you think of our new buildings have that wood in it versus stuff that we purchase?
I would say 90% of our buildings have some of that farm and wilderness wood in them. It's very rare that a building is constructed without it these days. And I would guess over the last 16 or 17 years, we've done close to 60 building projects.
That's incredible. And that's a bit where I was going next, right? When you think of those 60 building projects, are there some that really stand out to you, whether it was the uniqueness of the building or how it got made? What are a few that stand out for you?
The ones that I always remember the most are the ones where camper or alumni were involved in building it. Those are the great memories, right? Those buildings, I think, mean more to anyone than if a contractor comes in and builds a building for you. And all those buildings, for sure, are probably 50 to 60% F&W material.
Let's talk about one of those buildings in particular. If you think about one where there really was a really great synergy and partnership between you and kind of the camper program side, is there one that stands out? You can tell us a little bit about how that process, what that looks like, especially for folks especially for our alumni who are listening, who really like thinking about buildings back in the day were built with campers. We're still doing that, right? So could you talk about one, just choose one?
Well, this summer, Wolf's Cabin down on the waterfront was one of the more exciting projects in recent memory. And I think what made it exciting is that there was a camper that was really excited about leading that project and building a coalition to get it done. And that means camp staff or me are not pushing to kind of get that building. I mean, this thing took on a life of its own, and that's what really made it fun. And I think the memories for those campers involved, I'm sure you can speak more to that, but it was great to see the enthusiasm and excitement.
Yeah, I love that. So one thing that folks who visit us and who have been here at Farm Wilderness will marvel at is the kind of the diversity of our building design, right? And you can really trace how each building was built with the help of campers. They all look a little bit different. And particularly at Firefly Song and Timberlake, you can really trace these like eras of design. And I have mentioned to you and to other staff who listen to me that like you are starting to develop, because of these 60 buildings that you've been helping with, you've been designing a few of the more recent ones. And there is like a J design firm trend kind of running through our buildings now, which I think is really beautiful and really amazing. And I really like looking at the TL barn and seeing some of the steps and be like, okay, that reminds me of the art barn over there at Tamarack Farm and things like that. So I'm curious if you could get your designer hat on a little bit. And when you think about these projects, what are you thinking about when you are designing these buildings for Farm and Wilderness, both from like the land and impact and things like that, but also just your aesthetic choices to blend in with the rest of Farm and Wilderness?
Well, since I started building these buildings, you're right, W. It's rare that you'll see one without a 6x6 timber somewhere in the front of the building. And so when I think about the actual design, we need something that fits into the landscape really well. We need to think about something that's strong, that meets building codes, something that meets the programmatic needs that are going to happen in that building, whether that means, and that's often a very large open front, hence large timbers. They lend themselves well to that. And then in the whole time I'm thinking about these things, I'm thinking, what materials or ways of constructing will make it the easiest for the campers to build while still achieving those goals? So that's like the lens that I use.
When you're thinking about that process of the building during your design process, what does that look like, right? It can be easy for someone to design something with the expectation that adults are just going to do it in the typical way that adults will do it. How do you really balance those programmatic needs with just the needs of building something? Yeah.
So there's a few things that are just a practical matter. One, it's, when we build the foundation, we don't include campers in that because it's usually somebody with an excavator, right? And there's not really a way for them to get their hands on it. But that's like a really important piece of the building, that we have to have a good foundation so that the project will really be successful for them. So they've got a good platform to start from. And then I think once they take the project over, I've selected materials that are intentionally lightweight. And that doesn't always seem perfectly obvious to people, but I choose 2 species of lumber. One is pine, and the other is our very native red spruce or white spruce, very lightweight, some of the strongest wood in terms of strength for construction. And so I've had other people, when we've gone to the lumber yard to pick up our lumber, they say, hey, would you like some hemlock? That stuff weighs like 3 times as much. And I'm like, that doesn't work for us. I tell them, we need material that the campers can handle to help make these cool looking buildings. And the fun thing about like these big timbers that don't weigh a whole lot is when those things start going up in the air, you can see the excitement start to happen because it starts to look like a building. So when we talk about that design piece again, we think about what are campers good at? We think about that. What can they really take on and be successful at? And sometimes and we also want them to have the satisfaction of completing that project in a timely manner that is not frustrating to them. So there are times we'll do some pre-cutting, some of the more complex pieces, unless we have a camper that's really interested in that process. So a lot of times our staff over the winter, we say, hey, we have this activity building to build. Campers are going to be involved. We may cut a timber frame right here in the shop, label it really well, and then the campers can get to constructing that with a little bit of our guidance along the way. And those projects seem to be really successful. They finish them in the 6 to 7 weeks. And, I think everybody goes home with a smile on their face, including us.
I love that. Are there certain aesthetic choices that you have started to make? You'd mentioned kind of the big kind of open front. Are there other things that you have been doing kind of consistently across our buildings?
Yeah, so you'll notice often they're sided with shiplap, that's a board that's been milled with a tongue on each side designed to overlap. And that allows us to avoid using things like plywood and then siding. So it's a much simpler process. So basically, we don't have to side the building twice because they're not insulated buildings often. And then you'll also notice most of the buildings here have metal roofs. And we started those design standards 15 years ago. And part of that was based out of simplicity. Part of it was based out of ease of maintenance. And part of that was based out of really carbon footprint. We looked at metal roofing versus asphalt. We said, hey, when this is all done, we can recycle the metal. That asphalt ends up in a landfill somewhere. And then even 15 years ago, thinking we had an obligation to our next generation to do things as sustainably as possible. That's why those building standards were designed that way. And you take a ride down the road and you can see those elements in almost every single building.
Yeah. You absolutely can. I think it's pretty magical. I'm glad you brought up the carbon stuff because I do want to talk about that because you've been really extensively involved in reducing our carbon footprint since your time here. And so I think we do produce a report every year that talks about our carbon impact and the carbon footprint. So could you tell us a bit of what is the current state of our carbon impact and footprint? And then what are things that we've done over the years to reduce that? And maybe what's coming in the pipeline to further reduce?
Yeah. So carbon, we started that in 2010 under our Peter Bowen was our executive director at that time. And I got here and I didn't know what carbon footprint meant, right? I'm just like, what are you talking about? It was a little bit newer for some of us. But basically, we measured all our emissions from buildings, vehicles, and things like air travel and copier paper. And there's a few other things too. It's like where you get your electricity from. But really, like that first sort of look at what we did, that first report provided a baseline and it also provided a roadmap, right? So we could immediately look at that report and say, oh, this is where all our emissions are coming from. And at the time, it turned out to be our buildings. And obviously, once you read the report, it was number 2, fuel oil is the number 1 enemy. Propane was the number 2 enemy. So that was our roadmap. We looked at those things like, how are we going to reduce those? So we started looking at strategies to reduce fuel consumption in general or the load of the building. And the first thing to do there was weatherization, right? We came in, we had experts do blower door tests and thermal imaging, trying to find out where problems were. We hired people to come in along with our own staff, and we really super insulated things, sealed up cracks. It was really basic kind of stuff, but it made such a tremendous difference. And I remember the following year, our next greenhouse gas report even had improved like by 5%. It was pretty good. We remember Tamarack Farmhouse was one of our big buildings, heated all year round. What we decided to do was get rid of the number 2 fuel oil there altogether, got rid of that old boiler. And then we installed it's a pretty neat, especially at the time, gasification boilers. They're wood gasification boilers. 2 wood boilers, and they run hot and they store water in a giant tank. And then at night, the farmhouse, we have a circulator pump and it runs the water from the storage tank through the house to heat the building.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. What else have we done over the years to reduce our footprint?
So the next thing, we did some solar over at Timberlake on the roof. That solar hot water. We switched to electric dishwashers with less reliance on propane for heating water. We try to do that everywhere. Heat pump hot water heaters, and also heat pumps for all the staff housing that is heated throughout the winter. And those are some of the biggest ways that we really just have I think we're down to almost 4,000 gallons of propane a year. It used to be 10,000 gallons.
Wow.
And we used to burn almost 6,000 gallons of number 2 fuel oil, and I think we're down to 400 or 500 gallons.
That's a big drop.
Yeah, so it's been a giant transition from fossil fuel to electricity. And I would say also the great side effect of that is operating costs also lowered because of that. And our greenhouse gas emissions went from 350 metric tons down to under 300 metric tons. Mm-hmm. And we thought, well, you could have less campers and that number might go down, right?
Right. Yep.
But the data actually tells us that it's gone down 20% per camper over the years.
That's amazing. I often get questions from campers and families. They'll see the solar panels on top of TL and they'll see the solar panels here behind Resource. And you and I have had conversations about this. I'm curious, what might it take to get fully electrified, especially in the summer, right? Do we fulfill all of our electric needs in the summer from these solar panels?
Yeah, those solar panels provide all the electricity that we need during the summer and in the off season as well. The really cool thing about Farm and Wilderness being a summer operation, the need that we have really kind of mirrors when production is. And so in the shoulder seasons when solar is not being produced, we're not running camps. So that's just like a really neat attribute of the summer camp industry. But yes, we use about 100,000 kilowatt hours of electricity every year. Those 2 fields produce them. If we wanted to totally eliminate fossil fuels, we would have to have 3-phase electricity brought in to the camps. And that's a little bit more intensive electricity by the electricity company. So it's a whole different style of electricity, adds another conductor wire, super expensive. And so we've explored that, but just thinking the cost to do that would be tremendous. And so that's been the barrier for us. What may happen next, we have microgrids are becoming really popular. That usually involves the use of batteries. We have one of those up at the farm that Green Mountain Power gave to us. They let us use it as a backup supply. They feed the grid at peak times with that battery. So that's a partnership with us and Green Mountain Power. I could see that happening across the campus at some point. Every campus has its own battery supply. That would allow us to have the voltage that we would need to electrify and get rid of propane for cooking and all the other activities.
It's really interesting.
So we're really close.
Yeah, I love that. One thing in the last episode we talked about with Kelly and that you just sort of brought up and that I want to spend a little bit of time on is this idea that for staff and campers and families, we think of Farm Wilderness very much as a bubble, and your work and Kelly's work very much don't think of us in a bubble. And so much of the decisions that you make absolutely are thinking about what does the program need, what is the history of Farm Wilderness. But you and I have had a lot of conversations about what are the town bylaws, what are the state laws of Vermont, what are these constraints on what we can do.
Yeah, so the regulation, W, has gotten really, it's tricky to navigate. 20 years ago, zoning wasn't a big deal in many of these towns across Vermont, including Plymouth, where we live. And environmental regulations have increased. We have the Shoreland Protection Act now. Farm and wilderness is just geography makes it challenging to build because we're hemmed in by the lake on one side, and then we have all this wonderful land in Forest Legacy on the other side, which is, by the way, in most cases not appropriate to build on. But local zoning has setbacks, it's really challenging to kind of site a building somewhere on the property now when you get near a road or near the water.
We say more about that, what makes it challenging, especially for folks who maybe don't have context for Act 250 in Vermont, the things that keep Vermont super green, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. So the Shorelands Act, they have jurisdiction within 250 feet of the water. So you have to think carefully about when you build within 250 feet of the water, am I creating this impervious surface, which is like a roof or a parking area? You have to be careful about that. And then you have local zoning that has a minimum setback from the water of 100 feet for any new building. It used to be 75. It looks like it's going to 100 feet in the town of Plymouth. So that's local zoning. And then setbacks from the road, depending on how you orient the building, can be anywhere from 20 to 50 feet. And so when you look at this little sliver of land that we have that's all in between the road and the lake, you have a really hard time like finding a place to site a building nowadays. So that's one of our biggest challenges.
That's so interesting. And, again, for folks who are at home, we might not realize how many city and state ordinances are really impacting our work. What about in the other direction, right? All of our series for this spring is talking about what is the farm and wilderness impact on the world, on the people, all of those things. And so what is our impact? What do we have to give from your view of the system?
Well, I would begin with actually like my own contribution to the local community. I volunteer in many capacities. I'm on our select board in town. I'm also on the Planning and Zoning Commission, and I also volunteer with the fire department. And so part of it is making this connection with the town to develop understanding, right? And through understanding comes trust. So really, I would say fruitful things that have come from that relationship. An example is we set out to, I would say, reconstruct our town office building. Our experience here with green building gave me the skills over time to help guide this project. So the town, through the understanding of what it means to operate a building over the long term, many folks just concerned about money, but if you think about reduced operating costs, that usually means reduced carbon emissions. So we were able to convince the town to get what we call a net zero ready building, right? This is a building that can stand on be heated, provide its own electricity with solar panels. This is a really high performance building. And I don't think that building would have been chosen had it not been for Farm and Wilderness, my involvement in Farm and Wilderness support of that. So I think Farm and Wilderness makes an impact in many ways. I would say we've also had an opportunity to weigh in on zoning, say what's important to us. We are a great example of somebody who has developed their land, but also set aside 448 acres of that aside not to be developed right here on Woodard Reservoir. And I think that, makes sense to people. And I've often heard even our local planning and zoning chair said, these camps are a gem. I mean, they really appreciate the aesthetic. When you drive by the shoreline and you look over, you have to peek through the trees to see our buildings. They are not in your face. And I think people really appreciate that, what we've done here.
That's really powerful. We go more into the water kind of concerns too, right? Like you talked about being close to the water, but we've certainly had conversations too around our runoff and gray water and things like that. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit more from you too, because Kelly talked about in her episode, water being a big focus of our conservation efforts. And I know that is something that you think a lot as well. And then we'll go a little bit into water from this past summer after this.
Yeah, so water quality people are becoming really aware of that, and especially stormwater runoff, right? And forested areas produce a lot less runoff because the trees absorb the water. As an example, if we look out the office window here, I'm looking at these giant fields, but you'll notice there's catch basins. And we actually have a government permit to discharge stormwater. So it was part of an agreement for building this building. And so if we take that a step further, when we're looking at our camp buildings, we want to make sure we're doing the right thing, not creating places where sediment will be washed by water and into the lake. So that's one of the reasons they talk about the setback in the town. That's why Kelly brought it up. And all that vegetation between a building and the water makes all the difference for water quality, keeping that sediment out.
So this past summer, we went through a lot of water. There's a lot of things that happened. What I'm curious to hear a bit more about you is what was the impact of the flooding on the infrastructure here? And more importantly, as you think about, by the time this episode comes out, we're celebrating our 85th year. And so as we think about the next 85, thinking about what happened this past summer, what are we going to do to become more resilient? Because we learned so much this past summer.
We did. And my first learning experience was Hurricane Irene. This event wasn't that dissimilar. When I think broadly, I think we all continue to learn, including the state of Vermont, right? We lost Route 100 again, just like we did in Hurricane Irene. It wasn't, some of the places where they had improved didn't wash out, but it's like we still have a bit to learn about these storms. It does seem like we know where the water goes. Over the years, we've seen the washouts on our campus here, the main road, happen in the same places over and over. And over time, we've addressed the higher priority places, and that's often upsizing a culvert. That might mean doing a better job at planting to prevent runoff. And in some cases, we may end up looking ahead, relocating a cabin that's too close to a seasonal stream.
Yeah. You said upsizing a culvert. Will you explain what that means?
Yeah. So culverts are those big pipes that go into the road that you see. And they used to be 10 or 12 inches in diameter. And now we consider really the minimum diameter 18 inches and in some cases 2 feet. And closer to Tamarack Farm, we have a stream that's really more than just seasonal. And that culvert's been upsized to 4 feet. So you could literally almost walk through it.
Yeah, that is. I know campers who have. Yeah, that's a big one. We have waters. We're thinking about, you and I've sort of talked about heats. Again, building on this a bit more, think about the next 85 years. What do we need to do to our infrastructure, to our physical plant here? What are you thinking about to make us a more resilient place?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are thinking about this across the state. I know our utilities are thinking about it. I know our towns are thinking about it. And there's this phrase called hardening infrastructure, right? So that it doesn't fail during a storm. This summer, what was amazing during the storms is we did not see our internet or power go out.
Yeah.
Right. And Green Mountain Power has been talking about this for the last number of years about how to, mitigate the effects of these big storms and climate change by really they're proactive about tree clearing, thinking about where they're locating poles. So customers are less likely to lose service. And a thing that I've noticed whenever we have these storms, we kind of look at what has happened, what's going on. Timberlake Driveway, perfect example. That's been washed out several times over the last 10 years. And this was really our call to action. It's like, it does us no good if we can't get food to our upper lodge or transport people and equipment. So we really can't lose that road again. And for us, that means, widening the road, burying the appropriate size culverts, creating check dams, which slow the velocity of the water down and also help trap sediment. So we're not overloading, again, the Woodard Reservoir with a bunch of sediment from our roads. So thinking about how we're going to preserve communications, we may actually go to something like Starlink for a backup, just to that's another way of mitigating if we have a communications outage, right? Now we have a way to let parents know that their child's okay. So we're thinking about all these things, like how do we have backup systems if things go, just get damaged?
All really important stuff. I'm really glad that you were thinking about that. Let's bring it back to sustainable resource. And as you think about the future of kind of your work here, of the team that you're working with, what's on the docket? What are you looking to do this winter, the next few years, next 10 years? What is the future of sustainable resource?
Well, I think one thing that, we've had a lot of long-term projects that we'd really like to just, when you have 100,000 square feet of buildings, your project list never seems to end, right? But over the next 10 years, I would love us to see this, make this transition to electricity, have battery backups, maybe microgrids. That would be a real dream. It really gives you energy independence. So if the larger grids go down, you can have your own power supply. Our solar panels would work really well for that. So you can almost be on your own little island in the storm. I think there's a few program buildings that really need some attention. And I think that we're going to find some really fun projects to do with campers. And I think the next step is if we can get seasonal staff to really partner with us on designing some of those buildings, all the better. It makes it more fun for everybody involved. That gives other people ownership in the project. And I think it gives us a much higher success rate.
Is there anything else you want to make sure you bring up?
I mean, really what I think about the most, and the buildings have been a great example of like trying to get people to think about energy conservation and doing things the smart way, but the land and what this means for climate change. Because I think about all these kids that come here and their parents every summer, and I have to feel like I am doing the best possible job for them, right? They not only entrust us to care for their children, but we also have to lead them in the right way to just a sustainable future for them and their families. So that's weighs so heavily on my mind all the time. And being able to look people in the eye and saying we're doing the best job that we can possibly do.
That's really powerful. And I think it's a really great place to end. So Jay, I appreciate you spending some time with me today.
Thanks, W. It's been fun getting a chance to speak about these things that are really dear to my heart.
Amazing. You did great.
Thanks.
Well done.
That was fun.
How you feeling?
Good.
And that was my conversation with Jay, our Director of Sustainable Resources. If you'd like to register, apply for a job at, or just learn more, check out farmandwilderness.org. We're on YouTube, Instagram, and on TikTok, where we're featuring staff testimonials. Thanks to our guest Jay, original music by Emmett Powers, recording and editing done by myself. Thanks to everyone at Farm and Wilderness who helps make our summers possible. Our camp vocabulary word today is actually a name, the Susan St. John Resource Center. The building Jay and his team works in was dedicated October 23rd, 2010 as part of our Camperships, Cows, and community fundraising campaign. From Susan St. John's induction to the Circle of Light here at F&W, quote, "We are blessed to have you as a member of our community and as a camp parent, member of the Board of Trustees, clerk of the Buildings and Grounds Committee, and steering committee member of the Camperships, Cows, and Community Campaign. Your centered energy, vision, and knowledge of space and buildings, combined with pragmatic knowledge of fundraising, has been essential to F&W's success. Today, we recognize you as a member of the Farm and Wilderness Circle of Light and name the Resource Center in your honor. We appreciate her contributions, everyone else's to that campaign, and to everyone's future contributions to our future campaigns. With that, remember, Camp Magic is real, y'all. Until next time.